Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our summit, December 3rd. We have the speakers today, Andrea Ferstan and Tony Tolliver of Center for Economic Inclusion. We are excited to have you all here today. Feel free to ask questions, join me in the chat. Let's participate and have a good time today. I'll turn it over to our speakers.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Tony Tolliver, Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships and Impact with the Center for Economic Inclusion. I've been with the organization for 4 years, dating back to when we were Northside Funders Group and since the launch of the Center for Economic Inclusion. My relevant work for our conversation today in the past was that I've spent most of my career in corporate America, in roles that included public affairs and community relations and human resources, except for one period of time where I did some consulting for the Minneapolis Regional Chamber of Commerce, where I oversaw a program called the Partnership. The partnership is really relevant today because that program was designed to provide some support for mid to senior level leaders who had moved to the Twin Cities in hopes that they would establish roots and stay. It was designed because there was a history of mid to senior level leaders coming here for 2 or 3 years and then leaving. Some of those issues still remain, but there are other programs like through MSP, BMSP, I should say, that have continued that work. That's a little bit about myself. Andrea?
Thank you, Tony. I'm Andrea Ferstan. I'm Vice President of System Innovations with the Center for Economic Inclusion, and I've been there in this role since June. And prior to that, I actually was part of one of the integrated partners with the Center for Economic Inclusion as the Executive Director of the Greater Metropolitan Workforce. I have over 20 years experience in program development, strategic partnerships, and public policy work that I bring to this conversation. And I would say it's been primarily focused in on education and workforce development. So thrilled to be here today to really be part of this conversation with all of you.
A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We will use the chat in a couple of different ways. First, we ask that if you have a question, a comment, or you're inspired by something that we say, share your thoughts in the chat. Secondly, periodically, our team, working behind the scenes, will post questions to get a reaction from you. And Andrea and I will react to those chat responses that you share. And if there's questions involved in those, we will do our best to answer. Should we get started?
Let's get started.
All right. So our first slide has our mission statement on it. And instead of reading, thank you, instead of reading what the mission statement is, what I'll do is tell you what it means to me. What our mission statement means to me is that the Center for Economic Inclusion is uniquely positioned to provide leaders with knowledge and tools and resources to dismantle exclusive systems, structures, and policies and practices and replace them with ones that are more inclusive. The beneficiaries of those changes are applicants, their employees, their companies, their organizations. It's the community, all collective to create an economy that works for everyone. So this slide is part of the reason why we exist as an organization. Our CEO and founder, Tawana Black, was inspired, if that's the right word, to do something different. We originally were Northside Funders Group, but what we found was there were so many disparities in the region that she wanted to take action. She wanted to take action and create an organization that could help defeat these disparities. The disparities in the Twin Cities include or in our region include unemployment, wealth, wage, transportation and access, home ownership, and education, just to name a few. And with COVID-19, it has been reported that as many as 50% of African Americans in Minnesota have applied for some form of assistance since March, and 1/3 of our indigenous population has as well. Seeing 2008 brought me back to a thought that, or a moment that I had when Barack Obama was first elected. In that moment, I remember being so proud and having a conversation with my kids saying, you can be anything, you can do anything, you can have anything as long as you work hard. But here we are 12 years later, and those disparities tell me that may not be the case. In fact, if I were younger and they were too, the conversation might go like this. You can be anything you want. You can have anything you want, but maybe not here. And if we don't do some things to change the disparities in wage, in wealth, in transportation and access, in home ownership, in education, we may as well go to the schools, the high schools in the hallways, the middle schools in the hallways, the elementary schools in the hallways, and the daycare centers, and tell all of those children, you can be anything you want to be. You can have anything you want to have, but you might not be able to do it here. Is that a conversation that you can imagine having? I hope that our conversation today inspires you, inspires innovation, inspires thought, and gives you some ideas on how you can help individually, collectively, and through your organizations. Andrea?
Thank you so much, Tony, for sharing that. I'm going to take us on a bit of a data journey. And I want to start with sort of where is the MSP region and what's that look like compared to other regions. And from there, I'll move into really what's the business case for this work. So starting with where we're at today, it's worth noting that since the last recession or coming out of the last recession, Minneapolis and St. Paul, both cities, actually had a quicker recovery than most other cities in the country. But when you look at the layer underneath that, it was clear that our BIPOC residents were largely left out of that recovery. And what you can see here is that when we look at these dimensions of inclusive economic growth, you can see here how the MSP region is lagging in most dimensions. Next, I want to point to a pretty powerful data point around sort of where leaders believe things to be and where BIPOC employees are actually saying things are. And so you've got 2/3 of leaders who are believing that they're creating an inclusive, empowering environment. And yet when you actually check in with employees, only 1/3 of employees actually believe this to be true. What I want to lift here is that if we were able to close this perception gap by even just 50%, we would see a 1.05 trillion increase in profits. So this speaks to the fact that this is an economic imperative as well as a moral imperative. Next, I want to show a similar type of data point showing, and this is McKinsey data, that shows that when you've got an ethnic and racially diverse leadership team, when you've got an ethnically, racially diverse board of directors, and I would add not just diverse in terms of representation, but inclusive, meaning that we're leveraging that talent, we're leveraging and bringing in those different perspectives to drive that business. You see increases here, not small increases in profitability, but significant increases in profitability amongst these companies of somewhere between 30 to 43%. Next, I want to draw our attention to business creation. I don't know that we spend enough time really focusing on this, and I think it's particularly relevant as we think about our recovery. So if you look here, what you can see is that minority-owned businesses generate $5.2 billion in annual revenue. They're Minnesota's 9th largest employer. But I think what I find particularly striking is that they are growing at 3.5 times the rate of all Minnesota businesses. So when we think about growing our economy, when we think about recovery and how we invest resources and how businesses are intentional in their procurement, in their supply chain, this becomes a key economic driver in that quick sort of growth rate as we think about that. The other is that growth rate is tied to what hiring employees. So if we had parity between white businesses and BIPOC businesses, we would actually see 87,000 more workers. And we know that BIPOC businesses tend to hire more BIPOC employees. So this is a job creation strategy as well. The last data slide I'll just share that's a bit more macro is, as Tony referenced, we've got significant income and wage disparities in our community. If we had income parity, we would actually have $31.8 billion in GDP, 1.6% annual growth. So once again, I think the economic imperative is pretty clear here, that as companies think about, as they rightly should, their profitability, their growth, inclusion, racial inclusion specifically, is a key driver of that profitability. And we need to really embrace that, think about that, and what it means to then lead with that. I'm going to hand it back to you, Tony.
Thanks, Andrea. So the characteristics of an inclusive economy, to surmise what Andrea talked about, was access to opportunity. As we dismantle some of the systems and structural barriers that exist currently, we provide people with access. In fact, most people think they have access to opportunity. It's not until those structures and racist policies prevent them that they realize that they don't have access. But once you have access to, as workers, as consumers, as business owners, that creates an upward mobility. And as you grow and as things develop and as you accumulate wealth, that in fact impacts the community. A community thrives, and the power that is created to grow that economy doesn't just exist, that community I should say, it doesn't just exist with the folks who own the big businesses. It exists throughout the community, and everyone benefits, the workers, the home ownership is increased, the community thrives as a whole. And the work we do to try and make this happen isn't done in a vacuum. In fact, it's through strong partnerships throughout the region and across the country, and shared accountability. It requires shared accountability. And what we mean by that is holding each other accountable to take the proclamations and the words that we have dedicated, saying that we will end racism, we will do things differently, and putting those words into action. And our partners are in the public sector, they're in the private sector, they're in philanthropy, and they're in nonprofits. We all have to work together in order to dismantle these systems, to change. There's no magic bullet to this work. There's no one solution that is going to solve all these things. But we know if we work together, we can cultivate a community that thrives, that everyone has the opportunity to make choices where they work, how they grow, how they start businesses and things like that. But it's going to take radical innovation. We can't simply do the simple things. Those are important. Some of the things that we talk about, the solutions we talk about here shortly, are important too, but it's going to take radical innovation. And we also have to do it in solidarity. One of the things that I love about Tawana Black, our CEO and founder, is she often ends her messages and her emails with the words, "in solidarity." And that's how we have to work, in solidarity with each other to solve the issues of disparities in our region. So let's talk about how we do our work.
If I could just add a couple examples here on this piece of how we do our work, Tony. So one, I'm excited to say just the last couple weeks, we hosted a couple business roundtables. We had over 34 business, or around 34 business leaders show up representing different companies, really committed to coming together and driving change within their own companies. And I think that's really the launching pad for the conversation we're here to have with all of you today. The shared accountability really comes from not only what do we, where's our North Star regionally in terms of the goals and indicators that we need to be moving towards, but also how are we going to get there? What is my company going to do? What is my local municipality going to do? My county going to do? And that's really the table that we are setting and launching in our anti-racist economic justice trust that will launch in February. The other key piece here I want to lift is around the sort of place-based opportunity, regional opportunity. We've been fortunate to partner with a county that is really leading in this space, Ramsey County, in developing their economic and inclusion plan and bringing community voices to that planning process for many months now, and really saying, what are those innovative key things that we need to be doing as a county to really drive racial inclusion and inclusive growth? And those solutions are coming forward, and they're grappling with then how they begin to prioritize and think about that intention. That's another example of how we are partnering around that shared accountability.
Andrea, thank you for lifting those up.
Absolutely.
That's great. So let's talk about our consulting services. And Chris, if you could share the first question with the group, that would be great, and we'll come back to it in a second. So how we work with our consulting services. So there are 5 pillars. We've identified 5 pillars of racially responsible corporate action. And those pillars are areas that we know matter to businesses. We know that they impact the bottom line. And we also know that these are places and spaces where through change, an organization can become more inclusive. And if there's policies that are in place that are barriers to entry, that those policies can be changed in this space. So let's talk about actually the assessment. So we have a racial equity dividends assessment that we do. And that assessment is designed to give you a snapshot of where you're at with your inclusive work, diversity and inclusion, if you have policies in place. We look at your current state of affairs from a data standpoint. We look at statistics that your company keeps and your processes, and we'll talk to your employees through a survey and get their perceptions of the company. We'll hear from your leadership and get their perceptions of the company and any other key stakeholders that you'd like. And through that assessment, we're able to provide you with a strategy, a toolkit for success, a strategy on how you can do your work with more, with a racial equity lens. We provide referrals. Some folks think that we might be able to refer talent to them, and we're not a talent agency by any means, but we know there are lots of organizations that can help with supplier needs and talent needs and things like that. But each one of these assessments is customized to your organization. So we take a look at your data. We provide solutions for you that are over a period of time. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. There's no magic in this work. It has to be strategic. It has to be measured so that you can see where you're at along the way. And let's talk about the first of the 5 pillars, and that's people. So in this space, we often talk about recruitment, forgetting about the attraction piece of recruitment. So with the attraction piece, there are multiple gatekeepers within any organization. If you have external people who work externally to find talent, those are gatekeepers. If you have people who screen resumes, whether you have a system in place or individuals who thumb through the resumes, those are gatekeepers. Your frontline interviewers, those are gatekeepers. The next level of interviewers, those are gatekeepers. And if And for most companies, there's only usually one more layer of interviewers, and that's the person who makes the decision. All of those gatekeepers influence whether or not someone gets into your organization. So it's important that the communication about your strategy to hire, to be inclusive, cascades across your organization. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard organizations say, we can't find diverse talent. Chris, have you gotten any responses to the first question yet?
Not just yet.
Okay. So what I'd love to lift up with the group is, how do we solve for that? When we hear companies say we can't find diverse talent, how do we deal with that? Any responses from the chat yet, Chris?
And they are coming in. Just one moment.
Okay.
All right, we got a few coming in. We need to help companies do internal review of how they are sourcing and what their recruiting process looks like. Another comment: invest in the people that you already have. Another comment here: yes, absolutely. I lead an organization, university, that prepares people for work and enhances their knowledge and skills. I have often invited those who say they can't find diverse talent to connect with the university and create partnerships to provide opportunities for students to move into professional development. Very few take up on the offer. One solution would be to connect and explore partnerships.
Okay, Chris, I'll stop you there. One of the things that I would say to this is relationships. Relationships matter. I'll share a quick story with you. There's a company that had approached us. Part of my work at the center includes overseeing a program called North at Work, which helps African American men who have been chronically unemployed, underemployed, and about half of them have had some bout with incarceration. And we had identified a company that had expressed interest in hiring some of our guys. In fact, one of the senior leaders had made a proclamation that they would create a unique URL, and they would make sure that if our guys were qualified to do the work, that they would absolutely be considered. Well, about a month, maybe two later, that leader expressed some frustration. And the frustration was caused by the fact that no one had applied for those roles that they had posted. So much so that he wasn't sure that it would make sense for us to continue that partnership together. And to that, I would say, and this isn't to call out that particular company, because this happens across the region, across the nation. What I would say to you is, what is your presence in the community of which you're trying to hire talent? Do you have brand recognition? Have you invested in the community in a way that people know that you are invested in that community? Or are you just posting your jobs on your website, on LinkedIn, or some other aggregate site that caters to everyone, but not specifically to anyone? Relationships really, really matter in this work. I would say, Chris, could you ask the second question now, please? You can just send it out, and I'll come back to it in a moment. Another thing that companies can do in this space is to change the ability of their workers to build wealth. And you do that by understanding how, who they are and what they're able to do. One of the questions that I posed was, do your workers have more than one job? This is something that we would do in discovery as we work on the survey. Do your employees have more than one job? Oftentimes what this says is that despite having a full-time job, a full-time role, that perhaps they're not able to make ends meet. And that could be a sign of low wages. So it's important for companies to think about doing a wage and wealth inventory. Do you have opportunities for folks to learn about wealth accumulation as part of your benefits package? Those are all things that we would examine as we're doing our surveying and our assessment of your organization. Chris, have we had any responses to the second question?
Not just yet.
Okay, well, I'll cover it anyway. The second question is about, do companies know where their employees come from, where they live at, their commute time, and how they get to work? Why is this important? This is important because if you know where your employees work, not individually but collectively, you can understand if your wages are enough for them to live in the general area where your company resides. You can understand commute-wise if you're paying them enough to live in areas and communities that they'd like to live in versus where they have to live. If you know about their commute time, perhaps it will influence some of your policies. We did some work with an organization that had two sets of rules. One set of rules was for the leadership as far as the time of shifts, and the other set of rules was for people who were hourly. What they didn't notice at first was many of their hourly folks rode public transportation, and sometimes they would be late. A policy they had in place was if you're late, I think it was 3 times, that it could lead to disciplinary actions. Well, to their credit, after they spent some time talking about this issue because it had become a huge issue for the organization, they realized that all they had to do was overlap shifts so that it wasn't a punishment to those folks who had really no way to alter the time they got to work unless they got there ridiculously early. So this was a solution that one organization created on their own. And so these are the sorts of things that we would get to if we're doing an assessment with you. We would look at your board of directors. Are you attracting BIPOC folks to your board of directors? Is this something that you aspire to do? Chris, there was a third question. Have we had a chance to send that one out yet?
That's going out next, but I do have a few responses from the second question I can read out.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, I'll read a couple of them here. In general, I will say most do not. However, if you are connected with your employees as far as building a relationship, then you should probably know. Another comment here, I would add, do they know their employees are facing housing instability or homelessness?
Mm-hmm.
Third one I'll read here. I don't think it's a priority for most employers. I feel like their value is more focused on productivity.
Those are all really, really good comments, and things that we would lift up in our assessment, in our work with any given company. It is important for organizations to have relationships with their employees. And I'm not suggesting kind of a big brother type relationship. These are data points that will help with retention. And many companies do employee satisfaction surveys. These are the sorts of things that raise those scores so that companies can feel good about the culture within them. And that's the next question. And I'll talk about culture a little bit in advance of hearing what Chris gets the feedback from you all from. So culture to me is the norms within an organization. And those norms don't always align with the mission that's painted on the wall or that's printed on the various pages of documents that every company has, brochures and marketing materials. It becomes when people walk in the door, what they feel, what is allowed. Someone has a cliche, what you allow, you teach. And are you teaching the things that make you proud as a leader in a business? So culture is what becomes, what happens, what is tolerated inside the walls of your organization. And as an employee, your view of culture at work hopefully mirrors what the intent of culture is from the organizational standpoint. The organization should have the same or similar goals for culture as what an employee feels each and every day. If you do not, that may be the root cause of some of your issues with retention, with some of your issues with employee dissatisfaction, some of your issues with not being able to hire and retain BIPOC employees. Chris, did you get any responses on that one?
Not yet, but I do want to go back to your second one for our
Okay.
final wrap up.
Okay.
I have a comment. It's amazing how employers say they can't find diverse talent. However, they know how to sell and market their products in diverse communities. In my opinion, that statement is just a cop out.
Can I add a couple things here, Tony?
Absolutely.
So a couple things, I think that's a powerful statement.
Yeah.
And just speaks to the fact that, we need this intention because the consumer side is only one part of inclusive growth. The other side is leveraging the talent, and we have the data to show that as we shared. The other thing I want to lift is on this pay and benefits piece. It's such an important lever. I just want to speak to it a little bit more. And I think, companies often, and this goes for nonprofits, this goes for really all organizations, often do a bit of a one-size-fits-all in benefits, like here are the benefit package we have, with the one exception of higher positioned employees, executive level employees, often might get, whether it's stock benefits or whatever, and have different ability to participate in benefits. So what we're suggesting is having the conversations, whether it's via our assessment or whether you're holding focus groups, particularly with some of your entry-level employees, particularly thinking about that intention of maybe creating some safe space with BIPOC employees to hear what their needs, what the challenges, what the wants are, and then thinking about that same kind of specialization in some of the benefits. So one example I have is oftentimes there'll be benefits around education, going back to school and getting reimbursement for some of that, at either full reimbursement or maybe partial reimbursement. Well, if I am struggling to put food on the table, if I'm working, 2 jobs, whatever the case may be, I may not have the extra money to then pay that front end cost. So how do we restructure that benefit to say, we'll pay that front end, you give us the receipt after the document, but we will front end that investment in the tuition dollars, in the books, whatever it may be, because we care about your advancement within this company. That sends a powerful message, and that ties out to retention. And turnover costs are significant. So we have to acknowledge that these investments pay off over and over again for employers when they're making them. And it starts by listening, being in conversation, both with your employees and with the employees that or with the population you're trying to attract into your business.
Andrea, that is a great example. And part of my lived experience with companies that I've seen and I've worked with is that sometimes those very benefits to advance your education, the determination on who gets to do that is subjective to that person's leader and may not be written in stone. And that creates an unintentional barrier for people who have an interest in advancing. And that's an unfortunate consequence of having a benefit that is intended to do well, but may not. So thank you for lifting that up. Let's talk about procurement. So many companies buy things to exist, supplies, things, widgets, I call them. And what we would do in this space is ask you about how you buy your widgets. Do you have a formalized plan that includes BIPOC businesses? You know, I read somewhere that 98% of the companies in the U.S. are termed small business. That means they have 500 employees or less. And of that 98, I think 89 have 100 employees or less. And some other number, about 85%, don't quote me on these numbers, it's off the top of my head, 85% of that have 20 employees or less. So if you have a formalized procurement program in place that includes BIPOC small businesses, you can really change the landscape of those business owners' success. But it has to be more than transactional. There are times where companies don't have a certain percentage of their procurement dollars that are assigned to BIPOC businesses. You can only measure your success if you have things in place that are intentional, that are strategic, right? So we look and see what's the strategy behind your relationships with your vendors. Are there certain criteria that you have that enable BIPOC small business, BIPOC owners to be part of it? Do you have the ability to help them grow their business? Because those small businesses oftentimes hire more BIPOC people. So you're building a community by having strategy, by having a plan, by having measurements in place that will help grow your business and help grow their business. And if they are a company that has a tier 2 program where they have other businesses that they support, cascading those dollars intentionally can also help deeper. It can provide an even deeper growth trajectory for BIPOC owners. So just wanted to lift a little bit about procurement up. We would ask about are you connected to some of the major supplier programs that are available both here locally and nationally? And speaking of locally, one of the things that we really harp on is encouraging companies to use local BIPOC businesses. Sometimes, because of scope and size, companies feel like there's not local BIPOC businesses that they can turn to for their widgets, if you will. But I would say look local first, because what that does is that helps grow the local community. That helps advance the equity in the community, the opportunity for BIPOC businesses in our community. And now with all that, Andrea, I'll turn it back to you.
Great, thank you, Tony. So I'm going to take us now and talk a little bit about another pillar, policy. We recognize not all companies have the ability to participate in public policy, but many do, and it's a really important lever. And so there's a few things I want to lift here as best practices. One is advocating for those local policy changes that really improve outcomes for customers, for your employees, for BIPOC communities. So a few examples of that are access to affordable housing in the community, access to quality childcare, making sure we're being thoughtful about where that childcare exists in the communities, the zip codes, to meet the needs of community where they live and where they work. And then the last one I would just lift is public transportation. Do we have a robust public transportation system? What can we do to further build that out? We know that right now, many people have to take more than one bus to work. Waiting time in between, and Tony referenced this earlier, can make it very difficult to get to work on time. You add to that needing to take your child to a child care center or to a family-owned center, and that just further complicates that story. So this is about having a healthy region in which to attract talent, in which to retain talent, and also to allow your employees to fully show up because that stability is in place.
Andrea, can I add something to the public policy space? One of the best examples of a company doing great work in the public policy space, I won't name the company, but what I saw them do was when they had issues that they were fighting for at the legislature, they would arm their employees with the information, but they would also arm their employees with what people who oppose that position think. And what that does is it empowers your employees. It shows them that you care enough that you're aware of the issues on both sides. And what I think happened in that case was their employees were more likely to, or they actually got more involved in the issues and were more willing to call their representatives and encourage them to vote on certain policies and rules and laws and things of that nature. So
Great example. And I think, that further fosters one's commitment to working at that company. You feel further engaged and aligned. Another one is really looking at how companies align with BIPOC-led efforts, with BIPOC-led policy efforts, coalitions, organizations that are really driving anti-racist policies in the legislature or even locally. And so that can take on a number of different forms. One of it may be, an example would be universal basic income. It might be looking at policing reform or criminal justice reform. Another one is really looking at our K-12 system, the disparities that we have. Well, how do we think about policy solutions that really address those inequities and system failures? One example I'll lift that we're beginning to focus on is around sort of the disparities we have in post-secondary attainment. What needs to change within higher ed in terms of allowing both that access, but ensuring that completion as well? And so looking at some of those levers. The next best practice I want to lift in this space is really around paying just as much attention to what you're supporting as maybe pulling away from. And so we know that there's been lobbying efforts around, one example might be predatory lending products, like payday loans and other things. What are those alternatives? And so I think an example of kind of going to the other side of that, what I'll talk about in the next slide, is sort of research and development and the development of different approaches to that. So it's just as important to look at what you don't support as what you do support. And tied to that really is this PAC investment piece. So what are the candidates that you're supporting? Do they represent the values of advancing racial equity and inclusive growth? I think too often in this polarized environment, we may have one candidate over here that is supportive of maybe this one value in this one position that we have, and another candidate over here who is maybe for affordable housing, and then over here for lower corporate tax rates. And what we know is that we need to say we're leading with racial equity as a key driver of our productivity and profitability, and in doing so, all of the policies that fall underneath the candidates we support need to be aligned against that. Because as long as we have fewer resources due to lower corporate tax rates, for an example, it's hard to then support affordable housing over here. So it becomes the thread that pulls that all together. Next, I'm going to take us to another pillar, philanthropy. And so philanthropy is one I spent many years in, although not corporate philanthropy. And so I want to touch on a few things here. And one is really investing in multi-year flexible resources in BIPOC organizations, BIPOC-led organizations. And there's two words here I want to lift. Multi-year, because that really allows for building up that infrastructure that's needed to meet the needs in the community. And I'm thinking particularly staffing infrastructure, to build the relationships, to know that year to year you've got the stability to maintain that staff. The other is flexible. In order to provide culturally responsive services, to meet people where they're at when they come in your doors, we need to be able to provide organizations with the flexibility to do just that. And when we start saying what the funds can be used for, we limit organizations' ability to do just that. The next thing I want to lift in the philanthropic space is we cannot program our way out of the systemic institutional racism we have in our community and in our country. So we have to be investing in systemic change as well. We have to be investing in BIPOC leaders that are driving systemic change, in policy efforts that are driving systemic change, in organizations and coalition efforts that are driving systemic change. The last one I want to touch on is the importance of investing in BIPOC business development. This is critical, as we saw in an earlier slide, because this really speaks to that economic engine. Excuse me one second. We know that BIPOC businesses grow at a faster rate. We know that they hire more employees of color. And so this becomes a key strategy as we think about reducing disparities, as we think about growing our economy, and as we think about job creation. Excuse me. So next I'm going to take us to products. And, it's interesting the comment we had earlier in the chat, because I think this is one where we are seeing more companies partnering and investing in BIPOC businesses in part to reach that customer. And that's a positive thing. It can't be all that is done, but it is a positive thing. So I know I shop at Target, feels like on a daily basis, but on a weekly basis. And I see more products in that beauty section that are from BIPOC businesses. In particular, I'm thinking some Black-owned businesses that are geared towards the Black customer. And I think that's important. It's critical. We start recognizing that our community is more diverse than it was 10 years ago and will be more diverse in 10 years from now. And understanding what that diversity looks like and what are the customer needs, and doing that by investing first in the business and then in the customer through those businesses. And next, I want to lift up another example. So we talked a little bit about things that we want to stop doing, or we're recommending that you stop doing in the policy space. Well, research and development is an area in financial services where how do we begin to invest in, and I think we have seen examples of investments in financial products that really work for different communities, particularly as entry points. It can be alternatives to payday loans. It can be alternatives to building credit. I've seen examples of being able to build credit and paying off utility bills. These are ways that work for different segments of our community, and we need to recognize we need different entry points to building those savings. We need different entry points for being able to build credit, because credit ties to home ownership, to business ownership. All those kinds of wealth building strategies that are not only important for individuals today, but for their ability to pass on that wealth. Another example I want to draw on is really looking at ensuring equitable distribution and quality of resource in BIPOC markets and neighborhoods. So this one is, I think, particularly interesting in the time we're in. The example of grocery delivery services. Like, we didn't see this at this kind of scale a year ago, right? But we do today. And so are we ensuring that those services are available in all zip codes, or are available in really targeted, needed parts of our community? And so that's just one example of, as we think about services, making sure that that access is there and that intentionality is there.
Should we pause here and see if there's anything in the chat?
Please, yes, thank you, Tony.
Thank you all. So we are actually at 11:20 where we're going to open up for Q&A. Andrea, your 3 questions have been asked and you have several comments in here. So let me know if you all would like to start with some of these questions or go straight into Q&A.
Let's hear a couple of the questions now, and then we may just wrap up with a few more slides and then come back to the Q&A.
No problem. So you had a first question here. What policy issues aimed at racial equity and inclusive growth would you like to see business leaders engage in, or lobbying efforts would you like to see discontinued? With that one, we had broadband access, affordability, adoption. Another one here, affordable housing located near educational institutions and employment, the village within the city.
Wonderful. I'm so glad that people are chiming in, right? Because this is about a shared knowledge experience. So thank you for that. I think there's many examples of kind of what to invest in and what not to invest in. And would be happy to talk more offline, just recognition of time, but I think those are spot on. I would also just add that investment in BIPOC businesses. I'm really thinking about what are those key economic drivers, looking at what sort of transportation policies are really out there, and making sure that we're thinking about that public transportation system, particularly here in the metro area, and that advances, and that we're thinking about that advancement very intentionally in terms of key parts of our geography. And then in terms of policies, I think, to really to be cautious of, or to really look at moving away from because they're actually undermining racial equity. That's one I think we all could dig into a little bit further, but I think ensuring that we've got the revenue base we need is absolutely critical. So we need to look at what are those revenue growth strategies and how do we then prioritize those revenues.
And I would add minimum wage requirements.
Thank you.
Even minimum wage requirements are not enough. Those wage requirements are not aligned with family sustaining wages, and those end up creating situations where people have to have more than one job just to make ends meet. So I definitely would support something like that. Are there other questions, Chris, that you'd like to lift up for us?
They're not questions individually, but they're more so comments from the questions we posed.
Okay.
Good. Keep the comments coming. We're going to continue on for a little bit and then keep the questions coming as well. I just want to quickly touch on Tony referenced this earlier, our Racial Equity Dividends Assessment. This speaks to how we are working with companies on these very changes, these very best practices that we're lifting up here today. So we begin this work with this comprehensive assessment that incorporates sort of a survey of all employees, really deep understanding of what the life experiences that different employees are having, what they're experiencing at the company, but also digging in and understanding policies and practices. What is working well, where are the strengths, as well as where are those opportunities for really improvement. Then we do focus groups, we do interviews, we use all that data and we begin to visualize it to really look at how do you use that in setting goals and then really working in developing that action plan. And we partner with companies in the design of that goal setting, in the design of that action plan, and then actually executing that action plan through change management consulting services. So I want to give you a quick glimpse into what that dashboard then looks like, our Equity on Dividends Assessment dashboard. And you can see here how we visualize, how we disaggregate the data. There's certainly other ways of disaggregating the data as well, but by race and ethnicity is absolutely critical. And digging into understanding multiple jobs that people may have. Do they have the ability to save? What's their savings goals look like? Transportation time. People, like really digging into that, under each of these headings of attraction and recruitment and hiring and retention advancement has a whole series of other data points to really understand, once again, what's working and where there's opportunities for growth. Benefits is such a critical area. And then, and then we have procurement, and this last one I want to just draw attention is the Net Promoter Score, which just gives that one high level of asking employees, would you recommend working here to your client, to your colleagues, to your family members, to your friends? That gives you a sense of, once again, that perception piece, and it gives you a means of really tracking year-to-year progress. And so I will stop here because I know we've got probably more questions we can dig into.
Thank you all so much. We'll definitely get into a couple of questions and then a comment. First one here is a comment and a question. These stats are great. Did they come from a Pacific report?
Is it referring to the dashboard stats that were just shared?
Correct.
Yeah, so this comes from an assessment we developed that we use with companies. That is the survey that we do with all their employees, and then interviews and focus groups, and then we visualize. So it's a tool that company can then use in developing an action plan and setting goals moving forward. And then from there, we work and provide change management consulting services. So this is stats that we use. And then ultimately, we are looking at having a public reporting system as well, similar to what you may see with the Human Rights Coalition or with the Disability Index.
And to answer that question specifically, the data that was included in those slides with the assessment was dummy data. It wasn't real. It was used to create a visual for today.
Yes, thank you, Tony. Sorry about that. I meant to mention that.
Thank you. Question 2 we have here. Can you speak to strategies and provide examples of building anti-racism and equity into department work plans?
Yeah, generally at a high level, what I would say is take a look at your current policies and see if there's things that, and this is work that we are happy to partner with you in, to see if there are policies that are barriers to opportunity for people, whether it's things like how often do you do evaluations of talent, uh, how do you identify people who are high performers, what opportunities, growth opportunities that you have within your organization for people. It starts there, and I would just take a look at those things and see who's being lifted up in those situations, in those opportunities, and what were some of the determinants that allowed those folks to do that, and see if that's done equitably across your organization. Those are some baseline things that I would do. Andrea, would you add anything to that?
No, I just think that is what our assessment is about in terms of the private sector, is giving that baseline, doing that audit across these sort of 5P or really departments in many respects of philanthropy, of HR, of your procurement department. We do similar work on the public sector side that I do want to lift, that is about sort of, it can take many forms, but one form that we are looking at is really beginning with that kind of audit in key departments as well, that then allow to really lift up what is working and where you might begin to set target and strategies against key elements.
One of the things that that I wanted to lift up as well is it's important that you share your results as you measure things, and we can leave the slides. I'll just talk about it. I'll go to the very last slide in a moment. Once you dismantle or start to dismantle, the first thing you have to do is identify. So I'd say there's 3 A's to change in this space. One is the awareness, and the awareness is to call it out, to identify what those problems are. And we've shared with you lots of problems within the region that exist in other parts of the country, whether it's wealth building, wage, ability to buy a home, transportation, and health. That's one we didn't talk about earlier. Identifying the problem is the awareness piece. The action involves the strategy. How do you take what you see, what you are aware of, and create a plan, a strategy to address those things? We know that there's no one lever that is going to change all these things at once. It begins with one person, one company, one community at a time, but not individually, collectively, simultaneously, to get this work to where we have an economy that works for everyone, right? But you measure what matters. And so, Chris, going back to that question, the other thing is we would look at what that company is measuring, what's important to you. And thirdly, the accountability piece. To share your data about where you're at on your racial equity journey, whether you're sharing it with other companies that are in your sector or in your line of business or in your region, those are ways to hold yourself accountable and encourage others to do the same thing. But we realize that not all companies are in the same place, and so they may not be ready to share that. But if you can't share it publicly, it's critical, absolutely critical, that you share it amongst the leaders in your organization so that they have the same message, the same goals, the same strategy inside your organization to help you become more racially equitable. And lastly, investment. That investment means that you invest in people who work at your company, regardless of the level that they're in your company. It means invest in communities. It means investing in BIPOC businesses. All of these things combined together can get us to a place where we're moving in the right direction. And that's what we have to do. And
Thank you so much.
You have another question for us, Chris?
I do. It actually goes hand in hand with what you're talking about now.
Okay.
Any suggestions on approach to having conversations with employers beginning to engage in this work? This is a 2-part. How do you encourage them to engage more without turning them away? Also, how does the community deal with holding accountable companies who refuse to engage in the work?
I can start, but would love for you to build on it,
Okay.
Tony. I think, as I think about the first part of that, I think some of it is making sure we are framing this as the economic opportunity. And so some of the data points we shared today, certainly there's other data as well that really speak to that, so that this really is about the interests of those companies, those leaders. And then from there, I think it is about understanding sort of their needs and goals and how that can be framed in the context of inclusion as a driver for profitability. And then getting really into that, understanding where they're at today and getting then tactical about those targeted measures and strategies for driving the change in key areas. And I think that then creates a foundation of who do they need to be partnering with differently? How do they think about some of their practices in terms of how they design their interviews, to how they design their onboarding process? All those specifics come from sort of that set of steps that then lead to that level of specificity.
And I would say that very few companies, and I would venture to say that no company wants to, if you think back to the notion that I said earlier about going into the hallways of schools and telling children that you can't do it here, no company would dare say that that's how they feel, because they don't feel that way, right? What I've experienced is companies don't know where to start. And they don't know who to ask. Employees oftentimes may have ideas that they can share. And I would say share your ideas internally, because you can't give up. They may not have considered something that is obvious to you, but and maybe that strategy isn't there. We saw this June hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies standing up, standing tall, saying that they were going to fight racism and injustice. And I wish I could go back and look and see what those companies are doing. Many of them have created new jobs in diversity and inclusion. Many of them have committed funding and invested in BIPOC communities and businesses and things like that. But many are stalled. Some of the companies that we work with just don't know where to start and don't want to do a shotgun effect because they know that might not work. So I would say share your ideas, be impatient with the calling out of racism, but be patient with the solutions, because there is no one magic plan that's going to get us out of this mess. It took a long time to get us here. And I was going to close with this, but I'll say it now. Systems create the inequities. People have the power to change them.
Yeah, that's powerful.
Thank you so much. So we are about 7 minutes in, away from closing out. So can I get you all to give us any last remarks, comments, any last slides you would like to share with the team today?
Do you want to cover this slide, Tony, and then we can go to closing?
Sure. A lot of this, at this point, we've talked about a lot of this. But I would say never end your learning journey. As I prepared for today, I found myself distracted because there's so much information out there that has data, has suggestions, has ideas for you to think about things and how you could help with ending racial injustice and racial inequities in companies and businesses. One example in procurement is Chicago United, 5 Forward. It's a program that was designed to help grow businesses. So if you're in the procurement space and you've never heard of Chicago United 5 Forward, Google that. It's an organization that I learned about in preparation for this work. But continue on your learning journey. We are a willing partner. If you have interest, if your business has an interest in working with us, let us know. There's a form on our website for you to fill out. so we can do some of the discovery work together to see if now's the time. Speak up. Things that are causing inequities, that are causing barriers, that don't allow people to have access to opportunity are all around us. That is why this region has struggled for so long, and that is why we will continue to struggle if we don't call those things out. Support BIPOC people and BIPOC businesses. That investment, without it, we have nothing.
Yeah, I would just lift up two things as I think about sort of the lift that we all have to own, and that is really recognizing that this is about cultural change as well as systemic change. And I think too often we've checked off the box with having this training or this assessment. And that's important. I don't want to say we should stop doing that, but that alone doesn't get us there, as we have learned over and over again, or we would not still be where we're at today. So we have to be thinking about the systemic changes as well. We have to think about our HR policies and practices. We have to think about our procurement where we've got procurement. We have to think about our philanthropic efforts differently. All of those pieces, and we have to think about how we leverage our employees in those conversations, particularly our BIPOC employees, our BIPOC partners, external and internal. Maybe that's our ERG groups. Maybe that is community-based organizations and community colleges. All of these assets in our community have to be leveraged if we're going to get to the outcomes that we want and need in our community. I also want to just add, as we look at this, it can feel overwhelming, and I acknowledge that. But this can be about saying, what are the two things we're going to work towards this year, and how are we going to get there, and who's going to help be the drivers in that? And then next year, based on assessing where we got, then looking at what we drive. Give people a sense of the vision over 5 years, but make it manageable year to year.
Chris, are there any other questions that we can address before our time is up?
There are not. However, we are right at our time mark here. So if you guys have any final thoughts, go ahead and share those now with the team.
Anything you want to?
What I would say is partnerships. Employers, if you have needs that aren't getting met, think about Career Force. Think about all the training programs that are provided in the local nonprofit organizations. Those programs sometimes are built without the employer at the table. Find ways to engage with those organizations to make sure that you're at the table as those trainings are being formatted and being designed, so that you have a steady stream of new talent that's coming your way. That's something that didn't get to lift up earlier, but I wanted to make sure that that's done. Apprenticeships and internships, those are ways to find talent, but make those experiences meaningful for people, not just a check in the box that this person was here and we are part of this program. Make it meaningful for both the organization and the individual having the experience.
I would just add, start with data, disaggregate your data, make sure if you aren't able to do that now that you're able to do it moving forward. Use it to really set the goals, and then make sure that you're positioned with clear actions in which to reach those goals and clear resources and staff commitment to reach those goals. This requires intention and it requires priority.
Lastly, please connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to meet you. We'd love to further these conversations. And if we can help you as CEI, we would love to do that as well.
And thank you for your time and being part of this conversation.
Thank you all so much. I want to again thank Andrea Ferstan and Tony Tolliver here with the Center for Economic Inclusion. Thank you all for joining us on day 2. We will hope to see you all on the main stage in just a little bit. So go ahead and take a quick break, get some water, and we will see you at noon. Have a great afternoon, everyone.